Hello and welcome. You know why you are here. I know why you are here. Let's just circle jerk about medieval settings being the best. Though, good or not, why are they popular? Why do we like watching people with diseases and covered in feces do stuff in a world devoid of technology? To make this more interesting, how about I put up a counter of how many times I utter the words medieval fantasy. Alright, like all fantasy, it is a means of refuge from the shitfest that is our daily lives. You had a rough day, maybe even a rough week? Sit back on the couch, open up Netflix and put on a good fantasy show, or boot up Witcher or something. It's up to your preference what genre of fantasy you pick, but for those cultured fellows like myself, which do indulge in some medieval fantasy, what is behind our tastes? Frankly, I've noticed that people who have somewhat of an inclination towards history, especially medieval history, are also adepts of medieval fantasy. Obviously. It also has easy to understand concepts, like sure, I can get behind people hacking each other with swords, and worse, that's a common thing as well, right? Oh, we got some dragons and supernatural creatures which just exist there? Awesome. Maybe there are also multiple races or the universe is built different or something. But why are we attracted to things that feel similar to our past rather than science fiction with spaceships and shit? Because it's fun from a dumb perspective. If you were to live in those times, life would be damn awful. If you were a peasant, you literally wouldn't accomplish anything in life, with few exceptions. But from a privileged perspective, if you can choose what you are and what you can do, well, that's pretty awesome. Who wouldn't want to be a knight or a ranger or even some sort of magic user, since we are talking about medieval fantasy? Some people are into it, other people despise it because of its inaccuracies and overdone tropes.
It appeals like the male fantasy.
Oh yeah.
And I agree, some of the lesser works which have little knowledge to back them up can feel ridiculous, stupid even. But if you get that perfect mix of historical knowledge, fantasy elements, and a compelling narrative, then holy mother of god, you've struck the medieval fantasy goldmine. At the same time, there's also the cool part that this setting is so loose. Frankly, anything that has historical weapons, or knights, or some sort of OG role-playing element can be categorized as a medieval fantasy. And that's a good thing, because we get a lot of variation. For example, looking at a completely random series that I've picked off of the internet, Berserk. Looking at some of these scenes, would you really say it is medieval fantasy? Hell no you wouldn't, but it does indeed belong to that setting. Sure, it has occult elements such as monsters and some magic which transcends the laws of causality.
In this world, is the destiny of mankind controlled by some transcendental entity or law?
But at its core, these buggers are just peasants and freaking mercenaries. You got nobles and kingdoms. It is literally a dark medieval fantasy. So, where do we draw the line? What can be considered medieval fantasy and what can't?
Well, actually, Star Wars is medieval fantasy because...
Nope, that's not gonna cut it. If there is a distinct prevalence of technology, it's not medieval. You can have a couple of elements. Let's take the case of ReZero, because I apparently know only 2 series to base my thesis on. Our protagonist arrives in Lugnica with his phone, but because there are also magical objects in that universe known as Mythia, he writes it off as one for the locals. And that's acceptable. Other minor factors such as the genres of a particular setting also do not affect this. You can have comic medieval fantasy in the form of the beloved Monty Python and the Holy Grail, or dark fantasy, or dramatic fantasy, you name it. Our focus should instead be directed to the very setting. Is high fantasy medieval fantasy? Can we consider the famous work of J.R.R. Tolkien as medieval fantasy? Let's take this slowly now. Sure, we have a lot of magic and divine beings, but we can just consider those as mythology because we had crazy mythology in real life too. There are also a number of fantasy races and creatures, but the actual structure of society and the overall setting is medieval fantasy. We did it, guys. We debunked high fantasy once and for all. And with this, there is no point in going into its lesser form, low fantasy. But there is a beginning. A root for all medieval fantasy. The concept itself has been twisted by time into the versatile genre I'm talking about out of my ass today. But medieval fantasy once meant just that, a fictitious iteration of a historical setting.
Da Vinci?
An amazingly well done series which is popular today and is of course manga because you know I love that weeb shit, is Vinland Saga. It is basically the story of the Danes and the Brits and their wars in early medieval times. It is not a historical account because it conveys a different, better defined character story following Thorfinn, who differs from his historical persona, Thorfinn Karlsefni. So it was basically fate all along! Another such medieval fantasy is the recounting of Miyamoto Musashi's history portrayed in Vagabond, one of the greatest manga out there. Damn, these Japanese guys are sure into history and literature. And there are hundreds upon hundreds of actual books, such as the Tales of the Round Table, which are loosely based on mythology and some historical events. Medieval fantasy is just history, but cooler. As I've joked about in the beginning, those times are notorious for the terrible living conditions that most people had to endure, but if you take that away, all that's left are epic tales of glory and bravery, and murders and treachery and incest. Okay, never mind. And even if you decide to keep those in a story, you can take advantage of that grittiness and immediately turn your narrative into a masterpiece. But this has been all for today. I hope you have enjoyed this discussion, and if you did, your support by either subscribing or checking out my Patreon page would mean a lot. Until next time, stay strong.